Imagine for a single second that you are locked in a cramped, stuffy cage with a tiger that hasn't eaten for an entire week, and the only thing separating you from its fangs is the thin, illusory mesh of your own reputation. The calendar reads October 30th, 1974. The clock shows 03:30 a.m., and we are in the heart of Africa, in Kinshasa, Zaire, where the air is thick with humidity, the smell of cheap liniment, and a sticky animal fear that makes your stomach knot. In the concrete box of the dressing room at the 20th of May Stadium sits Muhammad Ali, a man the world is used to seeing as an indestructible deity, an icon of confidence, the loudest voice on the planet. But if you step closer, if you look behind the mask of his famous bravado, you will see a picture that will cause your brain to experience a cognitive dissonance comparable to an electric shock. The greatest is not just nervous. He is in a state of deep, paralyzing terror. His hands, the very hands that are supposed to make history in an hour, are trembling slightly as trainer Angelo Dundee wraps tape around his wrists. And this tremor is not from the anticipation of battle, but from the realization that he may have made a fatal mistake by signing the contract for his own execution. You probably think Ali was afraid of losing the title. That is the version the newspapers sold us. The truth is that Ali was afraid of dying. Coming out against him was not just a boxer, but a natural anomaly, a killing machine named George Foreman. Foreman was 25 years old, at the peak of his physical power, and he had just destroyed Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, the only two men who had ever defeated Ali. He didn't just beat them on points, he blew them away like a hurricane blows away cardboard houses in the second round. The whole world, from Las Vegas bookmakers to the ringside doctors, was certain Ali wouldn't last 3 rounds. The odds were 4-1 against him. Journalists in the press box were already writing obituaries, discussing which hospital the former champion's body would be taken to. And Ali knew it. He heard the whispers. He smelled the scent of a funeral hovering around him, despite the crowd's chants of Ali Bomaye. But there was one specific moment, one detail that turned his anxiety into ice-cold horror, and this is our dagger, the evidence that explains everything. An hour before entering the ring, Ali went into the training area to warm up, and his gaze fell upon the heavy punching bag George Foreman had been using. Normally, when a boxer hits a bag, the leather of the equipment indents and snaps back into place. But what Ali saw made his blood run cold. On the side of the bag, where Foreman's signature punch had landed, there was a deep, ugly dent. The bag did not straighten out. The stuffing inside had been compressed into stone by the monstrous force of a blow that, in terms of physics, was closer to a collision with a truck than a human fist. Ali walked up to the bag, touched that dent with his finger, and a thought flashed through his mind, sharp as a razor. If he hits my head like that, my skull will crack just like this bag. Ask yourself honestly, would you be able to step into a fight knowing your opponent is capable of deforming dense leather and sand with a single touch? Most people would run. But Ali put on the mask. He started shouting. He started reciting poetry. He started insulting Foreman, calling him a mummy. The spectator thinks, oh, Ali is on fire. He's so confident. But this is where the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, turning the meaning of what's happening upside down. Ali wasn't shouting to scare Foreman. He was shouting to drown out the voice of his own survival instinct, which was screaming in his ears, "Run!" His volume was directly proportional to his fear. It was hysteria disguised as a show. And so he sits in the dressing room, waiting to go out. His fight plan, to dance, to move, to not let the monster touch him, is crumbling into dust before it even begins. Ali knows another secret that the commentators are silent about. The ring floor in Zaire. Due to the monstrous humidity and cheap materials, the covering has become soft, viscous, like a swamp. Ali tried jumping on it and realized his feet were sinking. He wouldn't be able to float like a butterfly. He would be slow. He would be a target. Imagine this level of despair. You're going up against the hardest puncher in history. Your main defense, speed, is neutralized by the floor, and in the corner of the dressing room hangs a bag with a dent, reminding you of what will happen to your liver. Ali realized he was walking to the scaffold, and he had no plan B. He simply put on his robe, hiding the tremors, and stepped into the dark corridor leading to the roaring bowl of the stadium, hoping for a miracle that by all laws of logic should not happen. He was walking to die beautifully, not even suspecting that in a few minutes, under a hail of lethal blows, his despair would give birth to the most insane and brilliant strategy in the history of sports. The sound of the gong, tearing through the humid, almost tangible stuffiness of the Kinshasa night, sounded to the 60,000 spectators like the start of the greatest show on earth. But for Muhammad Ali, it was the clang of a shutter locking him in a death row cell with the most dangerous predator on the planet. The first seconds of the fight seemed deceptively familiar. Ali flew out of his corner, his white shorts flickering across the ring, creating the illusion of that trademark dance that once brought him fame. The crowd roared as their idol circled the lumbering giant, throwing fast jabs that stung Foreman's face. The viewer breathes a sigh of relief. He's fine. He's fast. He'll manage. No, it was only an optical illusion, a facade behind which a catastrophe was already beginning to unfold beneath the champion's feet in the most literal sense. With every step, with every shift to the left or right, Ali felt his heart skip a beat in terror because his worst fears were confirmed. The ring canvas had betrayed him. The cheap underlay beneath the canvas, softened by the African heat and humidity, had turned the surface into a viscous swamp. His legs, his legendary wings that were supposed to carry him away from danger, were mired in this soft covering, dampening his speed and stripping him of his main advantage. He tried to float, but he felt as if he were running in a dream through knee-deep water, while a runaway freight train bore down on him from behind. George Foreman wasn't boxing, he was hunting. He paid no attention to Ali's light prods. He walked through them like a tank through brushwood, methodically, step by step, cutting off the corners of the ring, tightening the space around his victim. In the middle of the first round, Foreman threw a wide, sweeping body shot, and although Ali managed to partially block it with his elbow, the force of that contact shot through his body like an electric jolt of pain. This was the moment of truth, where theory meets reality. Ali remembered that dent in the bag in the dressing room, and his brain, operating in panic mode, issued a definitive verdict. If he continued to dance on this swamp, his lungs would burn out by the 5th round, and by the 6th, Foreman would simply smear him against the ropes like an insect. Plan A, to outbox the monster, died right there at the end of the first round, and Ali trudged to his corner, knowing he had no plan B, only a survival instinct, screaming that death was standing in the opposite corner, already measuring his head. And then comes the second round, the moment that made the entire boxing world freeze in a collective stupor and decide that the greatest had lost his mind. Instead of coming out to the center of the ring and continuing to move, Ali did something that contradicted all boxing manuals, all coaches' advice, and common sense. He backed up. He allowed Foreman to drive him to the ropes, and he stopped. Ask yourself, what do you do when a truck is hurtling toward you? You jump out of the way. But Ali pressed his back against the ropes, raised his hands in a high cover-up block, and froze, turning into a static target. Angelo Dundee, his trainer, a man who had been through fire and water with him, jumped up from his seat in the corner and began to scream so hard he lost his voice. "Get off the ropes. What are you doing? He'll kill you." The ringside commentators looked at each other, deciding the fight was fixed, that Ali was throwing the match, or that he had suffered a stroke while standing. For no one in their right mind would stand in front of George Foreman, allowing him to discharge his artillery into a stationary body. But this is where the Santa Barbara effect comes in, reversing the perception of victim and hunter. Ali didn't give up. In this act of madness, in this seemingly suicidal decision to become a punching bag, a strategy of despair was born. Ali felt the elasticity of the ropes against his back. He realized that if he leaned back, outside the perimeter of the ring, using the elasticity of the cables, he could absorb the blows, dampen their killing force, forcing Foreman to waste energy hitting air or the guard. This wasn't the brilliant insight of a chess player thinking moves ahead. It was the reaction of a cornered rat, realizing there's nowhere to run, and deciding to hide in the very heat of the fire, right under the predator's nose. Ali covered his face with his gloves, tucked his elbows into his ribs, and prepared to take the storm, hoping for only one thing: that the human body is capable of enduring more pain than human hands are capable of inflicting. He turned himself into a cocoon, inside which a boxer huddled in a ball and prayed, while outside a hurricane named George raged, confident he was finishing off his victim, unaware that he had actually fallen into the most cunning and painful trap in sports history. The next 5 rounds turned into the most public, most brutal, and most incomprehensible torture ever broadcast on world television. And if you think you've seen everything in boxing, you are wrong, because you have never seen a living legend voluntarily turn himself into a piece of meat for the ghost of a chance at survival. George Foreman, this young, unbridled minotaur, hammered Ali's body with such monstrous force that every blow knocked the air out of the champion's lungs along with sprays of sweat, creating a martyr's halo around his head, and the sound of these blows, thudding, wet, sickening, echoed under the stadium roof, making spectators in the front rows wince with physical pain. Ali hung on the ropes, crucified by his own strategy, his kidneys burning with fire, his ribs cracking, and his head snapping back like a rag doll's. But every time the referee was ready to step in and stop this madness, Ali would open his eyes and do something that broke Foreman's psyche more than any counterhook. He began to talk. Imagine the surrealism of this. You are hitting a man with force, capable of breaking through a brick wall. You are putting all your hatred and power into the punch, and he, pressing his ear to your shoulder in a clinch, whispers insults to you. It was that same Santa Barbara effect. Turned inside out, the victim was mocking the executioner. "Is that all you got, George?" Ali wheezed through broken lips. "They told me you could punch. Moya Babushka hits harder. You're disappointing me." Ask yourself, what happens in a killer's head when his victim refuses to die and starts laughing in his face? Foreman fell into a rage. He lost control. He began to punch, not with precision, but with fury, wasting precious oxygen, flailing, burning his muscles in the furnace of blind aggression, not realizing that this was exactly what Ali was aiming for at the cost of his own health. By the 8th round, a metamorphosis occurred in the ring that no one could have predicted. Time, which had been working against the aging Ali, suddenly defected to his side. George Foreman, who was used to ending fights in 6 minutes, suddenly found himself in the deep waters of the 24th minute of the fight, and he was drowning. His arms, those very sledgehammers that had left a deep dent on the heavy bag in the dressing room, were filled with a leaden weight so heavy he could barely lift them for protection. He was breathing like a steam engine, his mouth open, his eyes clouded with fatigue, and at that moment Ali, who for 7 rounds had pretended to be half dead, suddenly came to life. It was like the resurrection of Lazarus. Ali pushed off the ropes that had held him all this time, and that same lightness, forgotten by everyone, reappeared in his movements. He saw that the monster before him was no longer scary. The monster was tired. A visual silence fell. The stadium, which had been roaring all this time, suddenly went quiet, sensing the climax was near. Ali landed a series of fast, stinging punches, right, left, right again, and Foreman's head snapped, spraying sweat, but this was only a prelude. Ali waited for the moment when George, having lost his coordination, tried to clumsily move forward, and when it happened, Ali threw a combination that went into the history books. A left hook lifted the giant's head, exposing the chin, and following it, with the precision of a sniper shot, came a right cross. It wasn't the hardest punch of Ali's career, but it was the most timely punch in the history of sports. And here's the scene that makes your heart stop. George Foreman, the invincible, terrible Foreman, began to fall, but he didn't collapse immediately. He began to sink, spinning around his axis like a giant sawn-through tree that slowly, majestically, and inevitably topples to the ground. Ali stood nearby, his right hand cocked for a finishing blow. The instinct of any boxer in this situation is to hit again to guarantee victory, to drive the nail into the coffin lid. The viewer expects this final chord of violence, but Ali did not strike. In that fraction of a second, while Foreman was falling, Ali, whose face was a mask of concentration, held his hand back. Why? This is that very intellectual orgasm of greatness. Ali didn't hit him because he didn't want to ruin the picture. He didn't want it to look like a dirty beating. He wanted the world to see the greatest winning through strength of spirit, not brutality. He allowed gravity to do its job, following his opponent's fall with his gaze, like a conductor following the last note of a symphony. The sound of Foreman's body hitting the canvas was audible even in the back rows, and that sound became the signal that the old order had collapsed. The referee began the count, but everyone, Ali, the spectators, and Foreman himself, trying to feel for the floor with his hands, knew it was over. The tiger wasn't just defeated, he was tamed, broken, and humiliated by a man who made him believe in his own omnipotence, only to pull the rug out from under his feet at the last moment. Ali stood in a neutral corner, and in his eyes, tired and swollen, one read not triumph, but the deep, almost religious relief of a man who has just walked alive out of a burning house, slamming the door right in death's face. When the body of George Foreman, this 220-pound Leviathan, who seemed made of granite and fury, finally lay sprawled on the ring canvas, time in Kinshasa performed a somersault, dividing reality into before and after. Referee Zach Clayton began the count, and every digit flying from his mouth sounded like a hammer blow on the lid of the coffin where the myth of Foreman's invincibility was being buried. 1, 2, 3. Foreman tried to stand, his hands scraping the canvas, muscles tensing, but his equilibrium, shut down by Ali's pinpoint punch, refused to obey his brain's orders. He looked like a drunken sailor trying to stand on a deck during a storm, and the sight was so pathetic and majestic at the same time that the spectators, who a second ago were chanting Ali's name, froze in a trance. They weren't just seeing a knockout, they were seeing the collapse of an empire. On the count of 10, Foreman was still on all fours, and when the referee crossed his arms, declaring the end of the fight, the 20th of May Stadium exploded with such acoustic force that it seemed as if the very sky over Africa had split in half. At that moment, primal chaos reigned in the ring. People jumped over the ropes, trainers wept, photographers fought for the best angle. But in the epicenter of this hurricane stood Muhammad Ali, and he wasn't jumping for joy. You expect to see triumph? You expect to see him shouting, "I told you so!" That's what they showed on the news. But if you look at the unedited archive footage, you will see a man who looks not like an Olympic winner, but like a plane crash survivor. Ali raised his hands, but his face was contorted in a grimace of pain and utter exhaustion. He looked at the fallen Foreman, not with triumph, but with grim gratitude that this nightmare was finally over. He didn't win the fight, he survived it, and it is now, as the adrenaline begins to recede, giving way to the pain in his battered kidneys and ribs, that we come to the solution of the very mystery that has tormented experts for decades. How the hell did he do it? This is where that intellectual orgasm hits, when all the puzzle pieces, the fear in the dressing room, the viscous floor, the dent on the heavy bag, form a single brilliant picture. Remember that dent, our dagger. It was proof that Foreman's straight punch was lethal to the human organism. Ali understood this before the fight, and he understood that he couldn't dodge every blow, so he invented what would later be called rope-a-dope, but which was actually the use of the laws of physics against brute force. Ali didn't just hang on the ropes, he used them as shock absorbers. When Foreman hit him in the body, Ali leaned back, outside the ring, stretching the ropes with his back. The energy of the blow, which should have crushed his insides, went not into Ali's body, but into the elasticity of the cables. He turned the ring into a giant spring that absorbed Foreman's rage, leaving Ali with only bruises, but keeping his organs intact. It was the strategy of a suicide who decided to outsmart the executioner by letting him blunt the axe on his own neck. Do you think it was easy? Ask yourself, would you have the spirit to stand still while a man capable of killing a bull punches you in the stomach and believe the ropes behind your back will save you? Ali allowed himself to be beaten for 7 rounds. He took hundreds of punches, any of which could have been his last, for one single goal: to wait for the moment when the gas tank of the machine named George Foreman ran dry, and it worked. Foreman was exhausted not because he was weak, but because he was hitting a ghost that dissolved the force of his punches into the vibration of the ropes. Ali traded his health, his ability to feel pain, for the championship title. In the dressing room after the fight, as the crowd carried him on their shoulders, Ali collapsed onto a bench and closed his eyes. People were celebrating around him, drinking champagne, shouting that he was God, but he felt only a throbbing pain in his entire body and nausea from overexertion. He had performed a miracle. He had reclaimed the crown stolen from him 7 years ago, but the price of this return was written on his body in bruises the size of dinner plates. He proved to the world that intelligence is more important than strength, that strategy is more important than youth. But deep down he knew that tonight he had aged 10 years in one night. That dent in the bag, which had frightened him to the point of trembling, was now metaphorically transferred to his own body, and although he emerged the winner, he understood that this fight had taken a portion of his resources that could never be restored. Zaire 74 became the peak of his legend, but it was a peak he climbed barefoot on the edge of a knife, and the scars of this ascent would stay with him until the end of his days, reminding him that even the greatest has to pay in blood for the right to be called king. When the lights of the 20th of May stadium in Kinshasa finally went out, and the last echoes of the mad chanting Ali Bomai dissolved into the stuffy African night, Muhammad Ali was left alone, with a silence that was louder than any gong. You probably imagine this night as an endless party, where champagne flows like a river, and the winner dances on the tables, celebrating his return to the throne. That is the glossy picture Hollywood sold us in the movie Ali, but the reality hidden behind the closed doors of his hotel room was not like a triumph, but like the aftermath of a heavy car accident. Ali lay in the dark, unable to move, every inch of his body throbbing with a pain that reminded him he had just allowed the human equivalent of a freight train to run over him several times in a row. He won the title, he made history, he humiliated the skeptics, but in that darkness, a realization came to him that sent a chill down his spine. The very rope-a-dope strategy that the press had already dubbed brilliant was in fact an act of slow, conscious suicide. Remember that dent on the heavy bag, our dagger that we saw at the beginning of this story. Foreman left it with one punch on lifeless leather. Ali allowed Foreman to land such punches on his kidneys, his liver, and his head for 7 rounds. Hundreds of punches. Thousands of kilograms of kinetic energy absorbed by living flesh. Do you think it left no trace? Do you think the cushioning of the ropes saved him? That is the greatest lie in boxing. The ropes saved him from a knockout, but they didn't save him from destruction. That night in Zaire, Ali paid for his greatness not with money, but with his future. Neurologists and doctors analyzing his career today point to this fight as the point of no return. It was there, under Foreman's hail of blows, that those microscopic, irreversible changes began to occur in the brain of the greatest, which in a few years would turn the most talkative man on the planet into a silent, trembling statue locked in his own body by Parkinson's disease. This is where the final, most brutal Santa Barbara effect kicks in, forcing you to rethink the price of success. We are used to calling Ali a tactical genius. We admire his cunning. But look at it from another side. What if it wasn't genius, but the despair of an addict hooked on the needle of fame? Ali knew he couldn't beat Foreman in a fair boxing match, on his feet. He was too old and slow for that, and he decided to trade his health for victory. He consciously placed his head under the hammer, because his ego would not allow him to lose. He won the fight, but he lost the war for his own life. That dent in the bag eventually turned out to be a dent in his destiny. He emerged from the jungle a king, but inside, he was already a broken man whose reservoir of resilience had been drained to the bottom. This victory became his curse. If he had lost to Foreman, perhaps he would have left boxing earlier. He would have kept his mind, speech, and coordination. No, the triumph in Zaire convinced him of his own invulnerability. He believed he could take any punishment and come out unscathed. This belief made him stay in the ring far too long, taking fights with Shavers and Holmes that turned his old age into agony. The Rumble in the Jungle is not just a sports drama. It is a Greek tragedy about a man who stole fire from the gods, but was sentenced to eternal torment for it. And the most terrifying part is that he chose this sentence himself, signing it with his blood on the canvas in Kinshasa. And now, as we stand before the face of this monumental story, looking at archive footage where a young and beautiful Ali raises his hands while Foreman crawls at his feet, I want to ask you a question that should shatter your comfort and make you think about the nature of heroism. We love winners, we love legends, but are we ready to admit that sometimes behind a legend stands not a divine gift, but a monstrous, irrational sacrifice? Who was Muhammad Ali that night? Was he a brilliant strategist who outplayed everyone, using his intellect to defeat brute force, and whose tactics deserve a place in the textbooks? Or was he a mad suicide who in a panic threw himself under a tank, surviving only through incredible luck and a superhuman capacity to endure pain, but paying a price that no human should have to pay? Was this victory worth 30 years of silence and trembling? Whose side are you on in this debate between the result and the price? Do you consider him a genius who knew what he was doing, or a lucky survivor who just lived through a game of Russian roulette? Write one word in the comments: genius or madman. I will be waiting for your verdict, because it is there that the answer lies to the question of what is more important to us, the shine of a medal on a chest or the health of the man wearing it.